welcome to both of those, all of you who are here, and those of you who are on live stream, who've been going from link to link to find us. So thank you for your patience in doing that, and we're so glad that you could join us. And I'm just very excited. I always am excited about the Klingenstein lecture. It's sort of a chance to catch up with old friends and sort of begin new ones. And I have many thank yous. And I guess, you know, it's the time of year when if you do something annually, you remember all the time before. And so that we remember those who aren't here, including the Klingensteins. I hold the Klingenstein Chair in Judaic Study, and Selma and Paul Klingenstein, together with many of their friends who also are not alive, made this possible. There are lots of them who are still alive too. But especially I want to thank Rabbi Sandy Saperstein of blessed memory. And Sandy, more than 20 years ago, was the visiting person at New College. While he was rabbi out in Longboat Key, he was here, he would teach one course a year, and students loved him. And he did this very rare thing, which was to make himself obsolete. He led the charge in the fundraising and said, we really need to have Judaic Studies be a permanent part of New College's curriculum. And so he led that fundraising, which made the chair possible, which makes what we're doing today possible. Jay Rudolph also was part of that endeavor, and he's certainly a sponsor of this lecture. So all of these people who are not physically here, but whose forethought and vision made what we're doing possible. Now, there are people here who make what we're doing possible. I will introduce our guests soon, but we've been just very much helped by Jeff Thomas and his whole team who run this, yes, way back there, who run this place and make sure all the mics are functioning. And so thank you, Jeff Thomas, for all the years of making things work. Kathy Heelan, who is the communications director, made sure that word got out. So we want to thank Kathy and all the people who work with her. Thank you, Kathy. And I want to mention other New College programs, because next week, especially for people who are part of today, you'll be interested in knowing Fleeing Atrocities, Witness Perspectives. This is a program that's co-sponsored by New College with the Dr. Helen Fagan Holocaust and Genocide Collection in our library, Jane Brankoff Cook Library, together with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So this is a program that if you haven't looked into, you should certainly, that's next Wednesday night here. And then I want to invite my colleague, Manu Lopez, to tell us about programs that are coming up about the Amish in Sarasota, and then I will be back.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for it. Oh, okay, yeah. So I just want to take a minute of your time, but I just want to bring your attention that as part of the religion program, we are organizing a series of events that are going to take place in February that are exploring Amish life in Sarasota. As a lot of you know, especially if you're from Sarasota, there is a small contingent that grows during the winter time of Amish that come to Sarasota to spend some of the winter. And I've been working over the last 2 years with a Mennonite who grew up here, but he has Amish roots. And we developed a tutorial, now it's a class, and now we're doing also a series of events. And there's actually 4 events. One that is February 7th. It's a talk that it's also the beginning of an exhibition that is going to take place between the 7th and the 24th by a local Amish photographer who captures the daily life of the Pinecraft community, the Amish community, and that's going to take place, all of the events are going to take place at the Carlisle Inn within the Pinecraft community. So the first event is basically a conversation with the photographer. The second event is February 16th, and it's a talk by J.B. Miller, who is a local Mennonite, who is also kind of an unofficial historian of the community, and he's going to give a talk about the local history of Pinecraft and how Sarasota became a settlement for the Amish, an unusual place for the Amish to be in many ways. And the last one It's a talk, Amish Across America, Growth and Change Among Traditional People, by one of the most renowned scholars of Anabaptist, Stephen Nold, who is going to talk about the changing trends in Amish communities across America. All events will take place in Pinecraft at the Carla Inn, and we'll share these online social media, and there'll be announcements all over the place. So you are welcome to attend. So thank you.
And the next person I want to invite up is our provost, Suzanne Sherman, who will give you an official welcome from New College of Florida. And so, Provost Sherman, please.
Thank you, Susan. I am so pleased to welcome all of you to the Klingenstein Lecture on behalf of President Oker and others in the administration at New College. As you know, hopefully many of you know, and if you don't know, New College is a public liberal arts college. We are ranked number 5 in the state of Florida, and we feel like we provide our students. Thank you. I'm happy to have. We are number 5. Yeah, we are the number 5, ranked number 5 nationally by U.S. News and World Report. We are also one of a small number of liberal arts colleges, most of them private, that are on the Colleges That Change Lives website. It's based on a book that was written many years ago, but the website keeps updating, and New College is always found on collegesthatchangelives.org. I am so pleased to be here. This is my first Klingenstein lecture, I am very sorry to say. I know that probably some of you have been coming for a number of years because this is a yearly event. And I want to thank Susan Marks for all of the work that goes into planning these lectures, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. So thank you.
And I know by this time, thank you. By this time you're ready for our speaker, and you'll have her in just one moment. But what I usually do at these events is to tell you a little something about Judaic studies here at New College. But as I was reflecting on this particular year and the challenges of this year, I thought what I most wanted to do was to talk about the place of Judaic studies in humanities, in liberal arts, with all the other disciplines that enriches it, even as it enriches them. And so you've heard from my colleague Manu Lopez, who teaches Buddhism, who teaches about Amish religion, and I could have students in my class who are studying Francophone literature as well as political science, as well as religion. All of that feeds humanities and means that to have Judaic studies at New College as part of the program is just such a rich experience. And I learned so much from Professor Wasserman, who I'll now introduce. At the conclusion of her book, which we've been studying her book together, and so my students in the second row here are just very excited to be able to meet her face to face. She is really talking about the dialogue that should happen between Talmud and humanities. And as she concludes her book, she talks about post-humanism. And she's gave me something that I never had before, which is to distinguish the idea that post, after, can mean two different things. It can mean a critique of, and certainly there are important critiques of Enlightenment and humanism and so forth, especially when you think about the disciplines of feminism and, a sensitivity to gender, sensitivity to race, and all the ways that you need to revisit humanism. So critiques are important, but another side of humanism and post-humanism means after, means you can't do anything without those who came before. Within rabbinic studies, we talk so much about standing on the shoulders of giants, and that those who came before us, didn't know everything, but we couldn't do what we're doing without standing on their shoulders. And that really puts humanities back into the conversation. That for all the shortcomings of a humanistic vision, it's so powerful that people should talk to each other and share with each other and ask, what is it that makes us human? And so it's my privilege tonight to introduce Rabbi Dr. Mira Beth Wasserman, who is just really an expert at taking sophisticated Talmudic ideas and telling them to us in English, in easy words that makes it understandable and a pleasure. So really making possible a conversation between Talmud and humanities that can hopefully take us farther and farther and farther. So please, without further ado, Mira, it is your mic and your time.
Thank you. I'm going to see if we can get these slides to work. Oh, they're hiding, Jeff. Something weird is happening on the screen. So. Okay, is it still here? You saw it, right? Okay, maybe I have to do last. I think there was a mirroring thing that I think happened when it turned off. I don't know how to get it off. Oh, great. Okay, now I get what it's doing. Okay. Whoa. Okay, great. Thanks for your patience, and thank you, Professor Marks, for that welcome and invitation, which I'm so honored by, and thanks too for being a terrific colleague and a wonderful host. I'm delighted to be here. My topic today, as you can see, is Me Too, the Talmud, and the ethics of accountability. And my remarks will focus on a passage from the Babylonian Talmud that those of you who are here in person have on a handout, but everyone else will be able to see on the screen. This particular passage that we're going to look at is one that I've taught again and again and again since the beginning of the Me Too movement in 2017. And there might actually be people listening today who have studied this passage with me before. As I make plain to you in a moment, my reading of this text continues to change as new events in my life, new things that I read, new events in our world trouble ideas that I had earlier taken for granted. This talk has been on the horizon for many months, but it is only within the past week that I learned that New College has become ground zero in a culture war. These events have gotten me thinking about how our discussion of gender and domination and the powers of speech might have new and different resonances in this particular moment, in this particular place. And after the talk during the Q&A, I will welcome your thoughts on the connections we can make between the Talmudic text and the moment we now inhabit. For now, I just want to say how much I value the intellectual integrity and the moral bravery of the learning community that faculty and students have nurtured here. What you do at this college has import for a much wider circle, for scholarship and for higher education and for democracy, and I want to extend my gratitude and my solidarity. So before I get started, I want to note that while the media and the larger public attend to Me Too issues only intermittently, victims and survivors do not get to turn off the reality and pain of having been harmed. The topics I'll be discussing tonight touch different people in different ways, and so I just want to invite everyone to take care of yourselves. And one further word about language. Some people who have been harmed by abuse or assault or harassment use the language of victim to describe themselves, and others prefer the language of survivor. I will sometimes use one and sometimes the other, and sometimes both. So as I said, my focus today is on an extended Talmudic narrative from Moed Katan 17a that I and others gravitated to in the first flush of the 2017 Me Too movement. My initial excitement about this text was actually something of a departure for me. I am trained in critical approaches to the study of the Babylonian Talmud, and this means that I seek to understand rabbinic literature within the historical contexts of the late antique societies in which it took shape. The Babylonian Talmud was edited in the 7th century in Sasanian Babylonia, and it reflects the teachings of sages of the first 6 centuries of the Common Era, sages who lived both in Babylonia and in the land of Israel. The Talmud is the foundation of much of Jewish practice and thought, but I generally come to the text with rather low expectations for how its content can address specific ethical issues in contemporary life, especially when it comes to gender. But tonight, I want to recount the story of what happened when I became excited about the possibility of the Talmud offering something more. And I seized on a Talmudic story that I thought could speak to the ethical questions of the moment. At the time, victims and survivors of sexual misconduct and abuse were organizing to tell their stories and demand justice. And I promoted this Talmudic narrative as a text that could not only support their ethical claims, but give them the imprimatur of Talmudic authority. Upon further study and in dialogue with colleagues, I revised my initial reading of the Talmudic narrative and came to a different understanding of what the text means and how it addresses questions of justice and accountability. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to make some general comments about Me Too and Jewish speech ethics, and then I'll turn to the Talmudic story, opening up 2 alternative interpretations that speak to power abuses and accountability in different ways. And I'll close with some reflections on what this exercise in bringing Talmudic materials into conversations with today's issues suggests about what the Talmud offers and doesn't offer contemporary ethics, and then we can talk some more. The Me Too movement was first founded in 2006 by activist Tarana Burke as a movement to help survivors of sexual violence, especially women and girls from marginalized communities, find healing and community. Burke was then working at a youth summer camp, and she reports that the phrase came to her as she reflected on how best to support a girl at the camp who had been traumatized by sexual violence and who wanted to disclose what had happened to her. At the time, Burke did not share her own story with the girl, and later it occurred to her that had she said, "Me too," it would have helped puncture a sense of isolation that so many victims and survivors feel. For Burke, Me Too was not so much a rallying cry as a consolation, a confidence, an invitation for survivors to find mutual support. She said of the phrase, "It's a very touchy, private, deeply personal thing. Me Too went viral as a hashtag in fall of 2017 when film actress Alyssa Milano used it in a tweet in response to revelations of Harvey Weinstein's crimes. Once the hashtag was embraced by Hollywood, the meaning of Me Too shifted. While Burke's primary focus was on sexual violence perpetrated against poor girls and women of color, the hashtag was invoked in connection to a wide array of sexual misdeeds in diverse corners of American life, but particularly in the halls of power, in politics, the arts, the media, and large corporations. What had once been an invitation to relationship, a private, deeply personal thing, became overtly and emphatically public, a call to expose the misconduct of the powerful and to hold them accountable. This shift from intimate speech to public speech is powerfully captured by the translation that Me Too underwent in France, where it became balance ton pour, or squeal on your pig. While Me Too are words with which one could privately, quietly receive a disclosure, squeal on your pig is a call to disclose, to call out, to name aloud and publicly. The Me Too movement traced a trajectory from silence to speech, from privacy to publicity. While some of the most egregious Me Too cases, the serial abuses of Harvey Weinstein, for example, were adjudicated in the courts, in most instances, the worst consequences that those accused have suffered can be directly traced to the publicity that attended their accusations. You might remember there was a time several years ago when forced resignations were the stuff of daily news, as comedians and congressmen, news anchors, and media moguls were publicly exposed and spurned. In those heady days, the scandals that seized the headlines were matched by an outpouring of personal testimonies on social media. In my real life encounters as well, it seemed like a dam had broken, and stories of abuse and objectification flooded forth from friends, colleagues, and relatives, all disclosing secrets long buried. It felt like something was shifting in the culture. It felt like there would, at long last, be an accounting for gender-based abuses of power. At the time, I was struck by how the Me Too movement exemplified a phenomenon identified by social scientist James C. Scott. In his 1990 work, Domination in the Arts of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts, Scott describes the transformative power that is unleashed when stories of oppression that have long been kept under wraps are at long last made public. Scott's theory of hidden transcripts begins with an observation that oppressed people tend to have two different modes of discourse, one for addressing the powerful in public, and another for a confined circle of secret sharers. Most of the time, people do the best they can to get along with those who have power over them. And the more vulnerable one is, the more pressure one feels to assuage those who are powerful, outwardly affirming the official version of events. But quietly and covertly, among trusted friends and confidants, the powerless speak the truth about the offenses that they suffer. These true stories of abuse and humiliation are what Scott calls hidden transcripts. They quietly circulate among oppressed people through complaints, gossip, and whisper networks, and are normally too risky to share in public. When a hidden transcript is at long last brought into the open, the very act of disclosure becomes a potent force for change. According to Scott, it is only when this hidden transcript is openly declared that subordinates can fully recognize the full extent to which their claims, their dreams, their anger is shared by other subordinates. Scott chronicles examples of how the act of publicly exposing hidden transcripts has sparked political movements and social uprisings unseating the powerful. During the early months of the Me Too movement, Scott's theory seemed like an apt account of the social upheaval and cultural shifts that the hashtag had unleashed. So apt, it got me wondering why such disruptions were slow in coming to the Jewish community. For all the stories of harassment and humiliation that I was hearing from friends and colleagues, for all the testimonies of assault and intimidation that were filling my Facebook feed, in Jewish communal circles, the shift that Me Too brought was not so much that hidden transcripts were now being spoken aloud, but rather that such stories were being shared at all, quietly, in anonymous posts or in hushed tones. I heard whispers that impugned major donors, rabbis, and other professional leaders of a range of improprieties and abuses. And yet, in contrast to the wider American public, within the Jewish world, there were long months during which public accusations of misconduct remained few and far between. To a certain degree, the logic of the Me Too movement runs counter to traditional Jewish speech ethics, which on the whole favors discretion over disclosure and privacy over publicity. Though there is certainly a robust tradition around rebuke and protest in rabbinic writings, rabbinic circumspection about speech is much better known and more widely emphasized. In one oft-cited Talmudic passage, embarrassing someone in public is compared to bloodshed. The dangerous power of the tongue is emphasized in classical rabbinic discussions of lashon hara, or evil speech, and it is reinforced in Jewish liturgy, in the daily petition that God guard my tongue from evil, and in the prominence of speech acts in the long confessional lists of sins that are recited during the season of atonement. And let me offer one further illustration of rabbinic circumspection with regard to speech by highlighting how an ancient tradition of speaking truth to power changed when it shifted from Greek culture into Jewish culture. The concept of parrhesia traces back to ancient Greece. Michel Foucault offered a series of lectures on the topic at UC Berkeley in 1983. The introductory lecture emphasized that parrhesia is truthful speech that entails risk because the speaker addresses words of moral criticism to someone with greater power. By definition, a king cannot engage in parrhesia because the king has the power to ensure his own safety. Parrhesia is courageous speech that is addressed to a king in defense of the public good. But it is not something that every subordinate is empowered to practice. It is rather a right or privilege of those who are free to engage in civic life. Foucault encapsulates the meaning of the concept like this. In parrhesia, the speaker uses his freedom and chooses frankness instead of persuasion, truth instead of falsehood or silence, the risk of death instead of life and security, criticism instead of flattery, and moral duty instead of self-interest and moral apathy. Julia Watts-Belzer has noted, however, that when the Greek word parrhesia enters the rabbinic lexicon, it undergoes a shift. In the Talmud, and we'll see this in a minute, bipharhesia simply means in public. It is not a word that describes a speech act, but rather its setting. The opposite of bipharhesia is in privacy or in secrecy, and Talmudic discussion develops different ethical norms to govern these two realms. For the ancient rabbis, a public setting magnifies the moral valence of any action so that transgressions in public are far more grievous than those same acts when performed in secret. By the same token, publicity is what allows ordinary piety to become magnified into an act that sanctifies the name of God. For all the changes that the word parrhesia undergoes moving from Greek into Hebrew, what unites the two concepts is a sense of danger. While Greek drama and Greek philosophy celebrate the courage of those who face down tyrants and speak truth to power, the rabbis of the Talmud caution Jews about the communal costs of speaking or acting in public. While the Greek concept of parrhesia aligns with the Me Too movement's ethos of truth-telling in public, the classical rabbinic response to the threat of tyrannical power has been to withdraw or retreat from public view. Now, I am interested in how this Greek concept becomes transformed in rabbinic culture because it offers a powerful illustration of the cultural context for the development of rabbinic speech ethics. While Greek culture could celebrate a figure like Socrates, a citizen of Athens who sacrificed his life in his dogged commitment to the truth, the ancient rabbis occupied a much different position with regard to state power. Rabbis might pursue philosophical questions of individual virtue like Socrates, but they also sought to define norms for a community to whom they felt accountable. Whatever authority rabbis were granted by the Roman or Sasanian rulers was always hemmed in by the Jews' collective vulnerability to imperial power. It is not surprising that within this socio-political context, ancient rabbis balked at the prospect of telling tales out of school. It makes sense that given the precarity of Jewish status vis-a-vis imperial control, rabbis would seek to avoid the risk of imperial interventions by embracing an ethos of restraint. The cultural context of the ancient rabbis makes their valorization of keeping silent understandable, but it also demonstrates how ill-suited this ethos might be to the contemporary context of democracy. When Me Too first surged within American public life, I worried that the traditional rabbinic emphasis on reticence and the well-known prohibition against public shaming were stalling or stopping the disclosure of hidden transcripts within the Jewish community. It was against this backdrop that I followed the lead of other rabbis and scholars and turned to the Talmudic story we will now examine together, promoting it as a rabbinic precedent for Me Too, an exception to the more dominant rabbinic emphasis on keeping silent. Later, my reading got more complicated, as I will explain, but let's look at the beginning of this story. There was a certain rabbinical student whose reputation was despised. Rav Yehuda said, "What should be done? Should I excommunicate him? But the sages need him. Should I not excommunicate him? But this would be to desecrate the name of heaven." He said to Rabba Bar Chana, "Have you heard anything with regard to this issue?" He said to him, "Rabbi Yochanan said as follows, what is the meaning of that which is written? For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek Torah at his mouth, for he is a messenger of the Lord of hosts." This verse teaches, if the teacher is similar to a messenger of the Lord, then seek Torah from his mouth. But if he is not, then do not seek Torah from his mouth. Rav Yehuda excommunicated the student. In keeping with the style of Talmudic narrative, the language here is terse. What are we to make of this unnamed rabbinical student? What did he do to earn a despised reputation? We are not told, but later on the storyteller will provide what I take as an important clue, reporting that this student died in a very peculiar way. And so now prepare yourself for a spoiler. We will soon learn that he dies from a bee sting to the penis. Since rabbinic storytelling generally presumes a sense of providence in which divine punishment fits the crime, this deadly bee sting is a strong indication that the student's offense was sexual. It is this detail about the rabbinic student's unusual death that led me and others to understand that the student's bad reputation came from whispered accusations of sexual misconduct. Rav Yehuda has heard the rumors and he takes them to heart, but he faces a dilemma. The student is doing valuable communal work. The sages need him, and so Rav Yehuda asks himself, what should be done? For me, it was the Talmud's account of Rav Yehuda's dilemma that first brought this story into such close alignment with the contemporary problem of harassment and abuse. In Rav Yehuda's musings, I can hear the unspoken calculus that so often weighs moral claims and the allegations of victims against perceived institutional and communal needs. Some individuals are considered too important, too valuable to be held accountable, even when their misdeeds are open secrets and the ethical considerations are quite clear. On his own, from the first, Rav Yehuda recognizes that to allow this rabbinical student to remain in his post would be a desecration, and yet he nevertheless hesitates. Rabba Bar Chana offers the moral clarity and religious authority that Rav Yehuda sought in his time, and that I sought for mine. Rav Yehuda then declares a shamta, a temporary ban of excommunication on the rabbinical student. In my initial reading, even as Rav Yehuda's initial indecision resonated with the reticence of contemporary Jews to act on reports of harassment and abuse, his enactment of the ban provided a model of how organizational leaders could overcome their hesitation. At the time, the popular press was full of accounts of he said, she said, a troubling shorthand that recasts accuser and accused as if they have parity, as if they meet on even ground. In fact, most abuses happen across a great divide of power, with accusers already bearing the initial harm and also bearing great risk in stepping forward and speaking out, while those who were accused rally the resources of institutions behind them. Now, the American criminal justice system puts the burden of proof on accusers, and this presumption of innocence of the accused is widely presumed to prevail in workplaces and communal spaces as well. But as many activists point out, the high threshold of evidence required in a criminal court is simply not appropriate to other spheres of life, and certainly not when safety is in jeopardy. When victims or survivors come forward to report misconduct, only to have their reports ignored or minimized, to have their credibility challenged, this not only harms the individual complainant, but sends a clear message that it is ineffectual and potentially dangerous to report wrongdoing. To my mind, the extrajuridical rabbinic institution of the Shamta provided a response to the so-called he said, she said quandary that authority so often invoked in discounting reports of victims. It offered a precedent for privileging the safety and dignity of those who are harmed over the reputations of alleged perpetrators. And it drew attention to the difference between standards of a courtroom and communal norms of safety and respect. In classical rabbinic jurisprudence, one needs the testimony of two eyewitnesses before a court can impose penalties. But any individual rabbi, and maybe others, can impose a shamta, or excommunication ban. In the surrounding Talmudic discussion, there are several different kinds of bans, of varying terms of length and degrees of stringency, and all of them are strategies for addressing wrongdoing that cannot be addressed by a court. Here, it seemed to me, the Talmud's account of Rav Yehuda offered a powerful precedent for how community leaders could take action, separating dangerous leaders from settings in which they were accused of doing harm in a proactive pursuit of safety and dignity. In the early months of Me Too, I imagined Rav Yehuda as a hero who finds the wherewithal to end the silence that isolates victims, forcing a colleague to suffer the consequences of his hidden offenses in a very public way. I invoked his story to bolster my argument that survivors of sexual harassment and assault could find support for their moral claims within the pages of the Talmud. Once I began to delve deeper into this text, however, other interpretive possibilities began to emerge. Now, we have not yet gotten to the end of the story, but before we return to the text and cover other details that complicate my initial reading, I want to acknowledge that it's not only my interpretation of the story that changed, my analysis of events in our world began to shift as well. Because it did not take long before developments within and beyond the Jewish community demonstrated that for better and for worse, the trajectory of Me Too revelations within the Jewish community was not as anomalous as I had first thought. I will not rehearse the large number of cases of misconduct that began to come to light beginning in the summer of 2018. Some allegations were sloughed off, dismissed with canned sorry, not sorry statements, but others instigated real shakeups and institutional change. Communal responses to sobering revelations of grievous misconduct and to institutional cover-ups continue today. But back in 2018, even as Jewish leaders began to come forward to say Me Too, instigating change within the Jewish community, the larger Me Too movement faced a devastating setback. In September 2018, less than a year after the surge of the Me Too hashtag, the harrowing Senate testimony of Professor Christine Boston-Ford electrified the country, but did not impede the man she accused of sexual assault from being confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. For me, this was a devastating demonstration of the shortcomings of James Scott's theory of hidden transcripts. Scott exalts the liberatory power of truth-telling in public, but had he considered the ways structural hierarchies buttress the power of institutions, making them all but impervious to victims' allegations? Institutions have their own reasons for managing, minimizing, and suppressing complaints, and often re-traumatize complainants with secondary victimization in pursuing institutional interests. Events in the news and closer to home led me to wonder if the Me Too movement was equal to entrenched, moneyed political forces, with the countervailing forces of money, power, and structural hierarchies in mind. The story of Rav Yehuda reads differently. So before we turn back to the continuation of the Talmudic text, I want to invite you to consider an alternative interpretation of the part we've read so far by invoking the insights of my colleague and study partner, Professor Sarah Lev. For Lev, the unnamed rabbinical student is not a perpetrator of sexual misconduct, but rather a victim of the institutional abuse of power. In support of this interpretation, Lev points out that the narrative provides no details about the foundation for the rabbinical student's bad reputation, and gives no indication whatsoever of a victim or of an aggrieved party. Even granting that that sting on the penis bespeaks a sexual sin, it is important to remember that within the cultural horizon of rabbinic life, any sexual activity outside of marriage would have been objectionable. Professor David Brodsky reads the student as queer. But whatever we might conjecture about the nature of the rabbinical student's offense, the content of his bad reputation, Professor Lev's point is that the student is not the worst offender in the story, but is himself a victim of power abuses. Whereas I had viewed Rav Yehuda's ban as a positive intervention in pursuit of safety and justice, Lev sees it as symptomatic of rabbinic overreach. Opposing mine and others' invocation of this story in solidarity with Me Too, Lev proposes that the text speaks more authentically to an atmosphere in which institutions sacrifice their more disposable person in order to protect the reputation of the institution and of the leadership. With this alternative interpretation in mind, let's return to the story and see how it continues. In the end, Rav Yehuda took ill. The sages came to inquire about his well-being, and the student who had been excommunicated came together with them. When Rav Yehuda saw him, he laughed. He, the student, said to him, "Was it not enough that you excommunicated even laugh at me?" Rav Yehuda said to him, "I was not laughing at you. Rather, as I go to the next world, I am happy that I did not flatter even such a man as you." Rav Yehuda died. Here, and the story will continue, but here, for the first time, we hear the voice of the excommunicated student himself, as he decries the personal insult of being mocked by Rav Yehuda when he comes to see him on his sickbed. What are we to make of this encounter? I think the text could easily sustain my initial reading, in which the student is an offender who acts with impudence, shamelessly pressing his own case without regard for the ailing Rav Yehuda. But Sarah Lev's more sympathetic evaluation of the student is also possible, for though the Talmud elsewhere classifies this Shamta excommunication as a temporary ban, with Rav Yehuda's death it will become indefinite. In Lev's reading, the student comes with a sense of urgency to protest and reverse his mistreatment. As the story continues, the disgraced student continues to press his case, appealing to one authority after another. He, the student, came to the study house and said to the sages, "Release me." The sages said to him, "There is no man here as important as Rav Yehuda who could release you, but go before Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya so that he can release you." He went before him. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya said to Rabbi Ami, "Go examine his case. If he ought to be released, release him." Rabbi Ami examined his case and decided to release him. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani stood up on his feet and said, "With regard to the maidservant of Rabbi's household, the sages did not make light of the excommunication she imposed for 3 years. With our colleague Yehuda, how much the more so?" Rabbi Zera said, "What does this mean that this aged man, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, who has not come to the study house for how many years now appears? Conclude from this that the student ought not be released." He was not released. He left, crying. A bee came and stung him on his member, and he died. They brought him to the burial cave of the righteous, and he was not accepted. They brought him to the cave of the judges, and he was accepted. It's a strange story. In this section, the rabbis close ranks, and the structures of power become ever more prominent. First, Rav Yehuda's colleagues inform the student that they don't possess sufficient authority to overturn his ban. The student will have to go to the land of Israel. They claim that only Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, heir of the line of the patriarchate, has sufficient authority to overturn this ban. Once in Israel, Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya deputizes Rabbi Ami to investigate. Rabbi Ami's inquiries lead him to move to release the student, but when he suggests as much, the elderly Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani rises to object that such a reversal would be an affront to the memory of Rav Yehuda. Despite the procedures which had been laid out by Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, the voice of the aged authority carries the day. The student dies while still under a ban. It is this turn in the story that prompts me to consider the tendencies of institutions to cover up wrongdoing and to perpetuate harm. However we judge the student and his offense, this part of the story dramatizes a failure of procedural justice as the student's appeal becomes lodged in the political machinations of the Rabbinic Academy. This is a powerful account of what feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed has called institutional mechanics. She writes, "Policies and procedures might exist on paper. We can refer to them, point to them, but what happens when you try to follow them or do something with them? There is often a gap between what is supposed to happen in accordance with policy and procedure and what does happen. So too here, though Rabbi Ami alone was authorized to investigate and decide, though he alone has examined the matter, the other rabbis' deference to the aged Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani and to the deceased Rav Yehuda carries the day. So, is the rabbinical student best understood as a perpetrator or as a victim? To a large degree, the divergences between these two possible readings trace back to the relative emphases an interpreter places on disparate details of this terse Talmudic narrative. Sarah Lev emphasizes the vulnerability of a Tsorba Mirabanan, a rabbinical student, relative to the authority of the prominent Rav Yehuda. But other details of the narrative pull in another direction. Rav Yehuda says the sages need this student, and Rav Yehuda expresses satisfaction that he does not flatter such a man as him. Absent evidence with which to adjudicate between my initial interpretation and Sarah Lev's opposing view, I am left instead with a strong sense of indeterminacy, a muddle which evades moral clarity. It leaves me wondering where in the story wrongdoing lies and what accountability should look like. Now, I realize it is tempting to draw parallels between the moral muddle the story induces and the challenges of adjudicating allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse. Today, divergent notions of consent and the significance of power differentials make the challenge of such adjudications a flashpoint in our culture, an area of deep ideological divide. But I want to resist that reading. I want to suggest that the muddle we feel as readers is actually an effect of the storytelling, of the gaps in what we are told. What makes this Talmudic case so hard to adjudicate is precisely the problem of secrecy and silence. From the beginning of the story until the end, the student's offenses remain the stuff of rumor and innuendo, shrouded in mystery. We never hear the voices of victims. The full story of the rabbinical student's offense is not known because the full story is not narrated, but rather suppressed, like a dangerous secret. In the absence of basic information, there can be no possibility of moral clarity. And in my rush to find a usable piece of Talmud, I had unwittingly recapitulated the failures enacted within the text in my own reading practice. I had bowed to the authority of the text, deferring to Rav Yehuda and the narrator's judgments, rather than attending to the story's silences. Ultimately, the indeterminacy that this story induces upon a slow and careful read is far more instructive than the moral example that I initially thought I had discovered in Rav Yehuda, because it trains my attention on how the storyteller colludes with the characters in keeping secrets and suppressing the actual story of sexual misconduct. The theme of secrecy becomes explicit in the coda that immediately follows the story, where the voice of the Talmud inquires as to why the shunned student is ultimately allowed burial in the cave of judges. What is the reason? Because he acted in accordance with Rabbi Eli. For it is taught, Rabbi Eli says, if a person sees that his impulse overcomes him, let him go to a place he is not known, wear black clothes and wrap himself in black, and let him do what his heart desires, but let him not desecrate the name of heaven in public. Bifar Hesia. Here, the Talmud literally banishes sexual misconduct into the shadows, insisting that it be kept under wraps. The mention of the desecration of God's name, Chilul Hashem, induces me to return to the beginning of the story, where Rav Yehuda invokes the desecration of God's name. Reread in light of Rabbi Eli's instruction, it seems that Rav Yehuda's primary interest is actually not in the fact of the student's offenses, not in the harm that he might inflict on others, but rather in the public reception of his offenses, the risk that action Bifar Hesia entails. The logic of desecration, as expressed by Rabbi Eli, directly opposes the public revelations of misdeeds by rabbis. This means that this Talmudic passage is not actually a counterweight to other rabbinic traditions that promote reticence, but very much of a piece with them. Ultimately, this Talmudic passage served as an ethical prompt in a very different way that I initially hoped it would. I first turned to this text because I saw a usable tradition, a textual grounding for principles of dignity and accountability that animate the Me Too movement. I seized on Rav Yehuda's story as a model that leaders of our time would do well to follow, only to discover how closely it cleaves to the very patterns of domination and silencing that the Me Too movement seeks to end. The point I'd like to emphasize in closing is not that Rav Yehuda faltered in his judgments, but that I faltered in mine. Seizing on this story as I did at first was an exercise in proof texting. I sifted and strained the roiling sea of Talmud in an effort to isolate that one gleaming pearl of wisdom, an authoritative source that would say exactly what I wanted it to, exactly what victims and survivors were already voicing in their calls for accountability. This is a serious lapse because what the Me Too moment demands is not the shoring up of old authorities, not deference to precedents from the past, but a new way of listening. Sarah Ahmed writes, "To hear with a feminist ear is to hear who is not heard, how we are not heard. If we are taught to tune out some people, then a feminist ear is an achievement. We learn from who is not heard about who is deemed important or who is doing important work. We learn how only some ideas are heard if they are deemed to come from the right people. The question of complaint is intimately bound up with questions of hearing, of how we express ourselves given what or who is passed over. If the whispered, hidden transcripts of harassment and assault are ever to become full-throated claims for justice, and if those claims are ever to be heard and addressed, old scripts will have to be set aside. Institutional hierarchies will have to be challenged. We will have to learn to listen to those who have historically been shunted aside. It now seems to me that in appealing to the Talmud to fortify the claims of victims and survivors, I participated in shoring up institutional authority, in privileging official transcripts over the testimony of survivors. What is the place of ancient text in contemporary ethics? I recount my experience with one particular passage to exemplify how Talmudic texts and the transcripts of our own lives can be mutually illuminating. I want to study Talmud without deferring to it. Talmud has always been a conversation across generations. It is my hope that voices long silenced, truths long relegated to hidden transcripts, can now move to the center of the page, shaping the public conversations of people today. Thank you.
So I think you all know what the students in my Talmud class know about the ability to see layers and layers and how they pull and push and challenge us to not read the easiest way. So I thank you so much, and I'm hoping that as you listen to the process and the exploration that our wonderful speaker, Mira Beth Wasserman, shared with us tonight, that you all have thoughts, questions, comments, complaints, things that should be shared and asked and explored further. Does anybody have a thought that they want to share? I'm sure we have a mic, or you could just... why don't you come up and just...
Wait, the mic doesn't.
Oh, okay.
Is working.
Hi, I actually don't have it's a question, not a comment. It's inverting the classic, I have a comment, not a question. So I was curious, there's the part where, you know, in the what I'm thinking of is the drama of the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani stood up on his feet and said, with regard to the maidservant of Rabbi's household, the sages did not make light of the excommunication she imposed for 3 years with their colleague Yehuda, how much the more so. Who do we know, like, what's up with the maidservant?
Yeah, this is fantastic. Good catch. She is actually, I mean, it's really interesting because that's the only place a woman appears in this Holy Synod narrative, so really good. She's a character who comes up time and again in both the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi there is the person we credit with editing the Mishnah, and he was the patriarch, so sort of the sensible leader of the community in the land of Israel. And there's many stories about this clever maidservant who is sort of, in all these stories, she gets the better of the rabbi, so she's a really interesting figure. And actually the Talmud, if we were to continue on down the passage, that's the question they ask. What's the deal with this? And apparently the story they tell is that she was once walking in public and saw a man strike his grown son. And I think I got this right. And she rebuked him and put him under this ban, which, you know, apparently was respected. So that's the story.
A rabbinic citizen's arrest, kind of?
Exactly, right. Yeah, she's really interesting because she's a maidservant and she's a what, right? So she comes from sort of the bottom of the hierarchy, but she kind of participates in the special status of the leader of the whole community. Really interesting. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So how does her presence in the story change or does it change any of the power structure?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's, you know, on the one hand, there's deference to her in a very surprising way, but the logic of the argument here is if we're going to defer to this maidservant, how much the more so do we defer to Rabbi Yehuda, right? So the logic there is she's at the bottom, right? So it's really reifying the expected hierarchies. Yeah. Interesting.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for coming. It was wonderful to hear this. Thank you. My question is kind of broad and a little.
We heard you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you the power by saying, in your opinion, for you, does the fluidity of these texts, as in their ability to change and for people to find kind of conflicting interpretations, does that make it harder to pin down in an academic setting or easier to pin down? And in that, how does that affect their ability to be interpreted for contemporary settings, like the humanities, in the way that you're trying to?
It's a great question. Yeah, now in terms of the academic setting, I think what you're getting at is trying to understand it in the time from which it comes, is that right? So, you know, Professor Marx is really a great model of this because we don't have that much information outside of the text, but we do have some, and maybe a lot if you know where to look. Professor Marx knows where to look a lot better than I do in terms of there's lots of other contiguous cultures of the times who leave writings, and there's also material cultural artifacts that we can look at. So there's sort of detective work that we can try to do to try to figure out the meanings of the texts in their context, but we have a lot of limitations, right? And, you know, in a sense, that malleability is an invitation to contemporary folks to find in the text what they want. Now, you know, some people will say that that's picking and choosing, right? I mean, I think in religious communities, people pick and choose all the time. And it can be liberatory to find, to discover friends in the ancient past that can be sort of your companions in the contemporary moments. I just think it's important to have intellectual integrity enough to say, sort of like, I know what I'm doing. I'm taking responsibility for being more than 50% of the conversation between me and the text. So, yeah, I sometimes envy people who study periods sort of closer to our moment that have so much more evidence, but I kind of like the invitation to imagine ourselves into very far away worlds too.
Other questions? Thank you. Let me phrase the question this way. As you're thinking about, as we all watch the news and the Me Too rise and fall in the way that you reminded us all so much of, what does it mean to sort of re-examine moments of hope and change and whatnot that maybe this playing with the text that you shared help us enter our own conversations with the changing times and the changing texts that we're looking at? Do you have examples of texts that you read differently as the world changed, things that you're looking at that maybe were evoked by what Professor Wasserman shared? Thoughts there?
So, I was trying to formulate a question, so what I'm going to say doesn't directly respond to your comments, Susan, but I'd like to hear a little bit more from Rabbi Wasserman about what you're modeling for us in terms of respectful debate. And you started with comments about how New College's model of education has come under attack, right? With some people saying that we are imposing a narrow ideological read on education, and those of us who are here recognizing that what we're trying to do is more open up spaces for conversations and to guide our students not to our conclusions but to theirs. So I'd like you, if you can talk about what is ethical about what you just performed for us in terms of considering contemporary situations and older texts and thinking about possible interpretations versus unitary ones.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think I'm learning more from your question. I'd like to sit with it for a bit. I think the conversation is important. I mean, one thing that you do here and that I do in my work is create conversation around shared texts, right? So I think that's really important when people, I think a lot of what is sparking the backlash that we're feeling in different pieces of our country in different ways is an anxiety that among people who think that there was a better time in the past, that things are coming apart somehow. So one thing that I was trying, that I've been wrestling with is, well, how do we really take account of the full complexity of who our community is? That the good old times were actually not so good for lots and lots of people. And so one ethical prompt is to make sure that more people are in the conversation. And if we're going to put texts or history at the center of conversations, then we need to lower barriers to access. And we do that through education, right? Bringing more people into conversation about the past, about I think that's an ethical imperative, right? But then once you bring in people, the conversation needs to shift. And I hope that I modeled that in some ways, that a conversation is not having lots of people listen to what you have to say, which has already been said, but really being open to finding new ideas, new insights. And, you know, I think a diversity of experiences really does uncover different aspects of ancient texts that we just didn't have access to before. So I think the conversation, I think, is sort of a great frame for ethics. And people call it civil discourse or whatever. I think it's much more alive. Like, I'm looking for civil sounds like, okay, you talk and I'll be quiet. I'm actually excited when, in the context of higher education especially, new ideas are sparked. One thing that was hard about moving online, I think, was sort of that magic sparkiness of a classroom, of things happening that you aren't expecting and that you couldn't anticipate. That we lost that a little bit in having to plan out things that were how they were going to unfold online. But that's the magic, I think, of a liberal arts classroom, right? New unexpected things can happen because important people are in the room uncovering things that the teacher wouldn't have access to alone.
And in what you did, disagreeing, right?
Yeah.
And I found that very powerful. You're opening up multiple types of movements. You're not articulating that you have the answers, but that you're trying to work through possible questions.
Yeah, let me also reflect that, you know, like a lot of my fellow activists are not so happy with the move that I take in this talk because I sort of shut down an important way to make an argument for change and saying, well, the text isn't actually the friend we want it to be. It can maybe do different things for us. So it's not always easy, like the disagreements aren't always so easy. And I think in different contexts, there can be different kinds of complexity introduced, right? So at a rally, you don't give a 45-minute talk interpreting a long, complicated text. You need to say one short thing. But that's why classrooms are so important, that we can take the time to really delve in and make things complicated so that we can all learn.
We have another question. Wiesel? And the mic is coming your way. So.
One of the things that struck me very deeply was you stood up and said, I was wrong. I totally misread this. And I'm wondering, we don't always see that, so thank you for that. I'm wondering where you go with that, how you further that message, how people can learn from you the modeling that we talked about, how to say, I was wrong, and go forward with that.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm a great believer in this practice of having study partners one-on-one. Learning one-on-one, it's a lot easier to be wrong with one other person. So I think I'm very practiced in being wrong because I study with really smart people. And then, you know, you can sort of go to a big, wider and wider circle of being wrong. I also, you know, I think so much about how I have the title of rabbi and I have the title of doctor, and it's easier for me, I think. I get some authority and respect in certain circles that makes it more comfortable for me to be able to change my minds. Thank you.
I love all the questions that you've got as well as your talk itself. So please give yourself a big hand as well as our speakers. And see you next year.